A, the Muratorian Fragment, an excursus. This paper will serve as an exploration of the Muratorian Fragment, its authorship, dating, and content. This paper will seek to answer questions about the fragment, such as, what is the importance of the Muratorian Fragment? What is the historical significance of the Muratorian Fragment? Whom was the author? What was the purpose of the document? Why is an understanding of the Muratorian Fragment important and relevant in a study of the historical and biblical canon? Not only so, but the paper will serve as a historical overview of the subject, surveying the historical perspective on the topic and the writings of others related to the subject. Furthermore, what controversies surround the Muratorian Fragment? What do others of high repute state about the fragment? Finally, why is the Muratorian Fragment helpful for scholars and students today, and what purposes does the study of the fragment serve? The present author hopes that the readership will take away the framework for further research and contemplation, in addition to the specific research areas included in this paper. The intent of this paper is to better inform, to inspire questions to which answers are sought for, and to spark further interest in the biblical canon and its beginnings. The Muratorian Fragment, an 8th century Latin manuscript containing an early list of New Testament books, was discovered by Lovedo Antonio Muratori, henceforth referred to as Antonio Muratori, curator of unedited ancient text at the Ambrosian Library in Milan. The fragment was then published in 1740 as an example of barbarous scribal transcription. The fragment Muratori was discovered in a volume of works on historical themes which Antonio Muratori sought to edit, and as the discoverer of the work, the Muratorian Fragment is named after Antonio Muratori. This fragment is momentous in that it was the earliest list of the books contained in the present-day New Testament canon. In connections to questions in theology regarding the canon and evangelical claims of the canon, the dating of documents connecting the canon to early church history are incredibly valuable and important. The importance and value of such documents is a proof of the canon, as scholarship thinks of it today, a closed, early set rule from a very early date in Christian history. Much discussion of the fragment Muratori is related to questions concerning authorship, dating, and language. It is the issue of language and authorship which the present author will presently address in some detail. Christophe Guinard, in his article, The Original Language of the Muratorian Fragment, argues that the Muratorian Fragment is a translation from Greek. The theory has weight as the Muratorian Fragment is written in Latin, yet the Latin used is amateur and sloppy, with thought and writing patterns common to the Greek language. This sloppiness and ungrammatical Latin suggests a few things. 1. The author was bilingual, whose native tongue was Greek, and sadly lacking in Latin. 2. That the work is a sloppy translation. Both of these theories will be pursued in some detail. While Guinard is convinced that the Muratorian Fragment is a translation from Greek into the Latin volume currently possessed, he is opposed by numerous scholars, such as J.J. Armstrong and G. Hanman. Despite the opposition, Guinard is supported by an even greater number of scholars as it relates to the original language of the Muratorian Fragment. Armstrong differs from Guinard, arguing in favor of the original language of the document being Latin, albeit in rather clumsy Latin that feels more like Greek than Latin. After Adolf von Harnack's initial theory of the original language of the fragment being Latin, other scholars in support of the theory soon appeared, such as Arnold Erdhart. The implications of such claims will be discussed further in a later portion of this paper. Arguing that the fragment supports evidence which supports a Greek original, Guinard is unconvinced by the argument of J.J. Armstrong for a later dating of the fragment. Armstrong argues for a later dating of the fragment based on a theory that the author was Victorinus of Pachow. There are numerous theological implications that go along with each dating of the fragment Muratori. If the fragment Muratori is indeed a translation from Greek to Latin, its date is the second half of the 2nd century. If the fragment Muratori was written in Latin by a bilingual author, then the dating of the fragment would be much later as a result. A later date, as in the 4th century, implies that the books of the canon were not so firmly settled until a much later date than has largely been supposed. An early earlier date for the fragment then resolves the issue of a need to set a canon, or at least a widely accepted canon, but offers with it an entirely new set of problems. But Armstrong is not alone in the debate regarding a later dating of the fragment, with scholars such as Albert Sundberg striving to prove that the fragment is indeed a 4th century work. Resolving the issue of language and authorship of the Muratorian fragment appears to be a mystery that none can solve satisfactorily. Scholars hesitate to affirm a late date for the Muratorian fragment, and weary of assigning authorship to an early dated fragment Muratori. The discussion between Guinard and Armstrong will likely continue, though perhaps not gaining enough attention to inspire and provoke much of modern scholarship to join the discussion in hopes of some solid, satisfying answers. The present author favors the argument presented by Armstrong, as evidence given for the argument is compelling. A bilingual author whose Latin was sadly lacking, and who is fairly well known, convinces the present author that a work penned by such a man would have fair insight and fairly represent the church at such a time and place. Victorinus of Patau, then, is not an unlikely author, and Armstrong's thesis is not unreasonable. Even Guinard is not willing to assign an author to the Muratorian fragment. Rather, Guinard suggests that the fragment belonged to a collection of works by Chromatus, due to the theory that the text was, number 1, older, number 2, thought to be a translation from Greek, number 3, that Chromatus was in close proximity to Rome, being in Aquileia, and number 4, that Chromatus was known to have texts in possession which none to few others had. Still, this is merely a hypothesis and does not point to an author, but a mere curator of ancient Latin and Greek texts. Bruce Metzger notes that the problems of attributing authorship of the text to Victorinus are identical to the issues which persuaded scholars to rule out Hippolytus as the author of the Muratorian fragment. In fact, J.B. Lightfoot accepted Hippolytus, am I saying this right? I don't know, as the author of the fragment, and his reasoning is thus: to this view I am predisposed by the fact that there was no one else in Rome at this time, so far as we know, competent to produce it. Yet, he was ruled out by the majority of scholarship as a possible author of the fragment. Yet, Guinard is convinced that scholars are much less interested in the original language of the fragment Muratori than Guinard himself. Scholarship appears to favor discussion and research which pertains to the dating and setting, or favor authorship above all mysteries surrounding the fragment Muratori, so Guinard assesses. Once a scholar decides on a particular answer for the question in mind, other pieces of information are simply tacked on to that theory. Guinard gives an example of scholars deciding upon a particular answer, such as the date and setting of the fragment Muratori, and then whichever side of the debate in regards to the original language is favored is the one which is sort of haphazardly tacked on to the prominent topic or debate. Henceforth, the present author has discussed in detail the controversies and questions related to the fragment's dating, authorship, and language. The present author has shown the recent discussion of Armstrong and Guinard over the question of language and authorship of the fragment, and the importance of such questions and their answers on greater scholarship. Now, the present author will turn to questions of impact, importance, and content relating to the Muratorian fragment. The present author would like to propose questions such as: what was the contribution of the fragment to scholarship? How did the discovery of the fragment further affirm and clarify the formation of the biblical canon? What books were included, disputed, or rejected in the fragment? And finally, what bearing did such discoveries have on scholarship in the past? What bearing do they have in the present, and what bearing will they have on the future? Now let us turn to the subject at hand. The Muratorian fragment is highly valued for its contribution, that is, a sketch of early Christian consensus about the New Testament canon. Indeed, Kearsarge Lake cites the fragment for the evidence it provides regarding the shepherd of Hermas. What did the fragment bring to scholarship? The Muratorian fragment lent insight into the early formation of the New Testament canon as is thought of today, a complete set of books for the saints. The Muratorian fragment contributed greatly to apologetics, making defense of an early canon much easier. Where silence was questioned, the discovery of the fragment was a voice in the void attesting to the development of the canon in the early church. Due to the information contained in the Muratorian fragment, it is known that by the end of the 2nd century, that is, assuming an early date for the fragment, that Jude was predominantly held as canonical. Furthermore, the Muratorian fragment mentions other canonical books, such as 1st and 2nd John, bearing witness to their canonicity in the 2nd century as well. The fragment contains the following books: Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, 1st John and 2nd John, Jude, Revelation, the Wisdom of Solomon, and the Apocalypse of Peter. The fragment is termed such because of missing parts of the work which have never been found. Paul D. Wegner affirms, the fragment is mutilated at the beginning, but must have originally contained Matthew and Mark, for Luke is said to be the third gospel. This fragment does not mention Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 3rd John. Extra books that the author includes are the Wisdom of Solomon and the Apocalypse of Peter, stating that some do not accept the latter. Indeed, the fragment makes very clear that the Shepherd of Hermas was not accepted as canonical, citing that it had only been written recently. F.B. Westcott comments on the Muratorian fragment, noting, the writer speaks throughout of a received and general opinion. He does not suggest a novel theory about the apostolic books, but states what was held to be certainly known. He does not hazard an individual judgment, but appeals to the practice of the Catholic Universal Church. There was not indeed a complete unanimity. With regard, yes, to all the writings claiming to be apostolical, but the frank recognition of the diversions of opinion on the revelation of Peter gives weight to the assumed agreement as to the authority and use of the other books. The Muratorian fragment lends insight into books which are disputed, accepted, or rejected in reference to canonical status. Consider the following excerpt from Bruce Metzger's translation of the fragment. The third book of the Gospel is that according to Luke. The fourth is that of John. The Acts of all the Apostles. As for the epistles of Paul, to the Corinthians first, to the Ephesians second, to the Philippians third, to the Colossians fourth, to the Galatians fifth, to the Thessalonians sixth, to the Romans seventh, once more to the Corinthians and to the Thessalonians, one to Philemon, one to Titus, and two to Timothy, to the Laodiceans and another to the Alexandrians, both forged in Paul's name to further the heresy of Marcion. The Epistle of Jude and the two above mentioned, or bearing the name of John, and the Book of Wisdom. We receive only the apocalypses of Peter and John, though some of us are not willing that Peter be read in the church. But Hermas wrote the Shepherd very recently, and therefore it ought to be read, but it cannot be read publicly to the people in the church. The Muratorian fragment is intensely valuable for studies regarding the New Testament canon, giving insight into the canon's influence, acceptance, formation, controversies, content, historical significance of the canon, and the importance of the canon. Early church historians with great and wide influence were aware of the fragment and cited it with purpose, such as the father of church history, Eusebius of Caesarea. Many notable scholars cite the fragment with researching or detailing a history of the formation of the New Testament canon and its content in its early stages. Consider the affirmation of Eckhard Schnabel. Extensive treatments of the Muratorian fragment in the 20th century, presented in the context of a discussion of the formation of the New Testament canon, include those of Hans von Kampenhausen, Bruce Metzger, Gregory Hanman, and Lee MacDonald. Indeed, one author notes, to speak of a Christian canon of scriptures at the beginning of the 4th century is an anachronism. The 2nd century, Yet to speak of a Christian canon of scriptures at the end of the 4th century is commonplace. In order to trace the history of the formation of the canon, scholars began their studies with the Muratorian fragment. For students of the canon, background knowledge of the origin and formation of the New Testament canon is highly useful, lending to historically informed and accurate theology, especially as it relates to the biblical canon. It is demanded of scholars, young and old, to have a polished rebuttal to an attack on the authority of the Scriptures. Yet without proper instruction in the history of the canon, such a demand is simply too much. How ought one to defend the authority of the Scriptures without insight into the past? How ought one to successfully present an apologetic of the Holy Scriptures without knowledge of its beginnings? Therefore, an overview of the history of the canon, and specific to this paper, a brief history on the Muratorian fragment, enables the readership to grasp important issues, discussions, and controversies which have followed and perhaps always will follow the question of the canon. In this paper, the present author has presented to her readership an overview of the Muratorian fragment as it relates to a careful discussion of the fragment. The importance of the fragment has been shown in all that it gives to a study of the New Testament canon. In this paper, the present author has explored questions of authorship, dating, and language, noting in detail the fragment's content, significance, and relevance to modern scholarship. Furthermore, the question of purpose has been addressed. The purpose of the original publishing of the document to the purposes contained in publishing and study. Finally, the present author has addressed the question of why an understanding of the fragment is important and relevant in his study of the New Testament canon and its formation.
Did it.
Pardon all of those blunders in there.
Got it.
Feels so tongue-tied.
It's good to start over again.
Yeah.
Get it all clean.
All right. So, any questions about it?
He mentions the Apocalypse of Peter. I've never heard of that even being contested. Does it still exist?
I'm sure it still exists. Maybe it's part of the Apocrypha.
Okay. I've never seen a Bible that had it listed in the Apocrypha, but...
Well, maybe, I mean, it could be something that's wholly separate because, like he said, it should be read, but it shouldn't be read in the church.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know much about it.
I was just curious.
And by much, I mean none.
In the formation of the canon that you've studied, if you'd run across some information on it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I thought that was interesting, too.
Yeah.
Like, hey, where did this come from?
And then when he mentioned the Paul's writing to Alexandria, which book is that?
Let me look in my notes. So he mentions to the Laodiceans, another to the Alexandrians. John, Corinthians, Ephesians.
Because I know my Bible doesn't have a book labeled the Alexandrians.
I know. I was thinking about that too when I was writing this. Philippians, Colossians.
And it would seem from
Philemon,
a canonical perspective that at the time of this writing, that they were considered commonplace to be read in the church, since he doesn't make any notation contrary.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because I cited two different authors and scholars when citing what the fragment said, especially about which, like the list of books. But yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Do you want to stop the video for me?
Yeah.